the legend. Greatness. Winks has done it. It's Ep5 Utopia.
Welcome to the heart of racing. Well, there are two plum jobs for race callers in this country. Lead caller in Sydney, lead caller in Melbourne. It's high pressure. There's millions riding on every race. Punters are watching every stride of their horse. They're listening to the caller. There's nowhere to hide. Our guest today is the Melbourne caller, Matt Hill. Now, you've got to say he's heading towards a career which could land him as one of the all-time greats in this country. But not only is he a master of race calling, we're talking about 6 Olympic Games, AFL Grand Finals, Tennis's Australian Open. He calls the Grand National in England, the famous race, even as the lead caller on the BBC. He's called at Royal Ascot. Not bad for a kid who won a John Tapp scholarship to have a go at Sky Racing back in 2000. Matt Hill, welcome to the heart of racing. Neil Breen here and Will Freedman's with me.
Neil, absolute pleasure. What an introduction. I tell you what, you made me a bit nervous at the start there, but you're quite right. The one great thing about calling horse races is that it's a raw job. There's no producers. You can't tap anybody in with 20 metres to go if you don't know who the leader is. It is what it is. But it's an absolute privilege to do it, and you get to see the best races, and you get to do it for free. So absolutely love it. Nice to join you.
Unlike your predecessors, Matt, you're doing this job at a time of social media. And in that intro there, I wrote about the high pressure. I know what it's like. I've watched horse races myself since I was 6 or 7 years of age. I'm only watching my horse. If you call it 3 wide and it's 2 wide, I go, what's he talking about? The feedback you can get is instant now. Do you feel that pressure?
Not really, because I don't look at social media. I think...
Good plan.
When I took over, I always planned not to look at it anyway. And it's amazing how people will come up to you and say, you know, you should be looking at social media. They're saying good things about you. To be honest, it's just one of those jobs that's not conducive for it. And I know if I've called a race well or not. I'm probably my harshest critic. So I don't really need to know what anybody else thinks, to be honest. And I think the problem is with calling races, it's a mental thing. So it's a little bit like the cricketer that's, at the crease and out of form, or the footballer that is about to play in a grand final. Any little negativity in your mind is not going to help you. And when they're moving into the stalls for a Cox Plates or a Melbourne Cup, I don't need that negativity. And I'm probably a bit of a sensitive soul too. So as a result, it would just swirl around in my brain and would annoy me. So the least I know, the better. The least I have in my brain before I go to calling a Melbourne Cup, the better. To stay focused, do what you're doing. And I've always thought too, if I was on social media, and I was sort of, wending my way through all of the social media tweets, I'm probably taking time away from stuff I should be doing, like doing preparation for the races, and I just don't have really time for it. And I'm glad I've gone with that plan.
Just on that, when we're talking about planning and your timetable, take us through the preparation you have when you're getting prepared for any race meet, but particularly the big meets. What's your preparation days in advance to make sure that you're ready for the big dance?
It's a good question, because I've sort of got a process now, and there's no real right or wrong rules to preparing for any sporting event. I think commentators in general find their own way. But as far as a spring racing meeting goes, the fields come out on Wednesday, as you guys know. So I'm straight into the form. I do the form like everybody else, try and find a winner like everybody else, mainly because you need to know the narrative of the race. And then once I've done that, a little bit different to the state of the form, what the form experts do. I go away and then I'll print the colours out. So I've actually got a sheet here for Turnbull Stakes Day on Saturday. That's my little cheat sheet with all of the names and the colours down the side. And then I'll now work on that. That's like my encyclopedia for a couple of days. I'll have a look at the history of the race, what jockeys have won it, what trainers have won it. All of those notes will go in. And a lot of it is just knowing what the colours are. You have to know them intrinsically. And that's the most important thing for me. And then the day before, I do try and get a little bit of extra rest because it's a big day. 10 races. I'm there at the track very early. I'm basically in a broadcast box for 8 or 9 hours concentrating. So you need to give the mind a bit of a rest. The mind's a bit like a computer. The more you stack it, the slower it becomes. So I try and give it a bit of a spell. Doesn't help we've got the races on the Friday night as well. So there's always a little bit of a trick to that as well, as just keeping your mind fresh if you can.
I take it, I've always thought about calls. The big races are difficult because they're big and the focus is intent. Cox Plate, Melbourne Cup, whatever it is, the big Group 1 race on Saturday. But I always thought for a caller, they might be easier to call because the horses are so much more familiar in a Group 1 race than, the benchmark 72 over 1,400 metres at Flemington with 18 3-year-olds in it.
Yeah, well, I get your point. And the thing is, if I was calling 18 up the straight at Flemington in May or calling the Coolmore, fundamentally I'm doing the same thing. I'm recognising the horses and calling them in the same order, hopefully, or in the right order. But it's more the pressure of the race. Like, so the Melbourne Cup, for instance, the fact that there's 24 runners isn't really a problem. It's the fact that a lot of people are listening to it. In fact, nearly everyone's listening to it. So that is the issue. And I'm sure it's exactly the same as saying to someone, you're serving out the match to win Wimbledon, or you're serving out the set to win the first round of Indian Wells. It's the same thing that you're doing, but it is different. And that's why calling a Cox Plate, I probably concentrate more than I ever concentrate for a Cox Plate and a Melbourne Cup, because you just don't want to make a mistake in those races.
Do you pre-plan some of the final moments of races, particularly, say, for Winx or a big horse that has a big story attached to it? Do you ever go through some scenarios in your head that you could... I remember hearing...
a line or two, a zinger.
I remember hearing other callers say that almost... Well, at least when Maccabi Diva was running, that they already had the last quote ready to go if it unfolded.
And the champion becomes a legend. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, well, there's some great stories about that. With Greg Miles was doing a radio interview on the Sunday before the Melbourne Cup with Bruce McAvaney, and Bruce said, "I'm sure Greg's got a line," and Greg all of a sudden thought to himself, "I don't have one. I better think of one if Maccabi Diva wins."
When he said, "and a champion becomes a legend," it was one of the great lines of all time. He summed it up in about 6 words.
Yeah, of course, and a lot of the time you don't have time to sum things up. You'd be lying if you didn't say that for those real big ones. I mean, I was thrown in. How lucky I was that when Greg retired, I had Winx's 3rd and 4th Cox Plates, and of course you have to do her justice because it was history-making stuff. So you do think of things. What I try and do is the inspiration of those things just comes quite naturally. I do remember when Greg retired, and I thought to myself, gee, I get to call Winx's 3rd Cox Plate coming up. Gee, the Valley will be rocking that day. And that was the first thing I thought of, and that was sort of the inspiration to what I said on the day. So a lot of the times you do have to think about it, but I think you try and let it happen as organically as you can, because you can tell when a line is scripted. Some of the best race calls, though, are the unscripted ones. Remember when Winx won her 2nd Turnbull, and she was in awful trouble. She was 3rd last on the turn, and she got out of trouble. And on the line, I said something like, "Well, they just can't beat her." And that was purely just what I was thinking at the time. And I think they're the best race calls, to be honest. But you are right. When you get a race like Winx's 4th Cox Plate, when she was almost over the line, you do have to do her justice and think a little bit about what you're going to say without scripting it too much.
The third one, the first one you did, which was her 3rd one, well, it didn't quite go to script. I was there that day, and Humidor just wouldn't give up. You didn't get a chance to go, because the race was actually quite close.
It's Winx in front. Humidor's coming at her. Winx is holding on. The Great Mare completes the great trilogy of the turf. Winx has won the Cox Plate by a half length. 2nd, Humidor.
Well, the thing was, I think everybody got a bit of a shock when Humidor appeared. It was such a brilliant Blake Shin ride that he sort of just appeared, didn't he, on the point of the turn? And almost on the turn, I thought, I might have stuffed this up. And I was sort of in shock for about 10 seconds. I think everybody was really in shock. It was such a dramatic finish. So yeah, you're right. A lot of the time, you might think to yourself, "Oh, what would I say if he won, or what would I say if she won?" A lot of the time, you don't get a chance.
No.
And I've always found with a race like the Melbourne Cup's completely different to the Cox Plate. There's a lot of theatre with the Cox Plate, whereas the Melbourne Cup, our task is pretty simplified. Get them in order, call the winner. And as Greg Miles once said, the most important part of your job, you call 120 meetings a year, you probably call 1,000 races a year, but the last 20 seconds of the Melbourne Cup is the most important.
Take us through. Obviously, we don't quite understand the environment you're in, but what are the main things you try to avoid? Like, what is the cardinal sin for a race caller where you go, oh no? Is it going the early crow and it doesn't come off? Is it misjudging the names? Take us through some of the anxieties you can have in a race, and I'm sure you know it's happening as it's happening. You're sort of going, oh no.
Yeah, so obviously forgetting a name isn't great, having a mental block on a name. And most race callers will tell you, Will, that it happens more than you think. But the more you call, the more you learn the names, they're in there. So you really have to just rely on your own abilities, that you do know what the horse is. And obviously those sheets that I just showed you, those little cheat sheets, they help, because you can look down and go, what's that horse wearing green? So yeah, that is an anxiety, is certainly forgetting a name, not knowing the horses well enough. But you do learn them so hard that a lot of the time it might be a split second that you've forgotten the name of a horse. For me, I think that the hardest part of calling races, particularly at Flemington, is seeing them. So it's easy to call a race when you can see the horses clearly, but a track like Flemington is so big. So for the Melbourne Cup, we have a marquee in the middle of the track. They disappear for 400 metres, so you have to divert to a monitor. So that can upset the rhythm of your call. You might be halfway through the field and all of a sudden they disappear. So it makes it hard if you can't see them.
How come you're in a marquee?
Really...
No. There's a marquee in the middle, so they from his vantage point.
His vantage point.
Yeah,
they go behind the marquee.
Yeah, so he has to go to the monitor to see the horses in running.
I suppose the Grand National will be the same. You've called it a few times.
Yeah, see, the Grand National is a completely different kettle of fish, because there's 40 runners and there's 4 race callers that do the same race. You basically, it's like a relay for a race caller. But yeah, Flemington, Chiquita Lodge, when they're past the 1,200 metre mark, they're a long way away from the grandstand.
Miles
so that's
away.
An anxiety as well. Yeah, so half the time that you're seeing them is you just hope that they spread out. Down the straight, those sprint races, if they huddle together, you've got to try and see them all. So there's little things in your mind that's going on, but you try and simplify it and think to yourself, okay, well, I've got to call them in order, get out as cleanly as you can, get the first 3 across the line, and then go from there.
Matt, everyone in horse racing's got a story about how they started. Well, we know Will's story. He's the progeny of a famous family. My story is my dad owned race horses in Brisbane in the 70s, so I was going to Doomben and Eagle Farm from when I was 5 and 6 years of age. You're from regional Victoria. Where did the passion for horse racing come from?
So I'm a Western Suburbs boy in Melbourne, and the thing was, I had a family friend who trained horses in Ballarat, but also my granddad was a great old punter. He used to be a barber just outside of Footscray, and he would, with his best mate, go off to the races, shut the barber shop at 1 o'clock and go and have a punt. And when I started being interested in racing, listening to the races, he took interest again, and we ended up going to the races every Saturday, and I had a vivid imagination. So when I started or taking interest in racing was probably about 1989, 1990, and there wasn't such a thing as TVN or racing.com or Sky Channel or Foxtel. There was not a lot of TV racing, or mobile phones, obviously. So as a result, I'd listen to the races, and I was spellbound by it, fascinated by these guys that painted a picture and with that magnificent rhythm of an Australian race call, and then the mystique of going to the races and getting a race book, and the smells and the sounds of race day. And you'd be sitting there at Flemington and Greg Miles's voice would just bang over the PA, and you'd think to yourself, geez, I'd love that job. What an amazing job. Every time he said something, the crowd would react. So I'd have a vivid imagination. I'd have little toy horses going around the lounge room, and I'd call their progress as they went around. And I was pretty much obsessed. Like every other racing person, you live and breathe it. You watch races every day, every night. And I've done that for the last 30 years. So it'll be a disease only cured by death.
It's amazing though. We've talked to quite a few people that come through racing. It's amazing how young it starts. Like going to the races
starts in childhood.
Yeah, it's something that's brought you're brought up in. You're infected by it, or it's infectious.
Just listening to Matt. So Matt became fascinated by the calling. You're fascinated by the training because that's your pedigree. Matt's fascinated by the calling. I'm the same as Matt. I ended up in newspapers as a newspaper journalist for a long time, and I used to recreate the at the finish from the newspaper and write it down, and pretending Dad's horses had won at the finish, and so simple, 1.5 and you know what I mean. So I wrote it down. The calling for me was like I've hosted a lot of radio, Matt, and television shows. How you call a race just blows my mind. I can't get my head around it. I just can't.
Well, it's interesting because I guess it's horses for courses, isn't it, to use an expression?
It is.
I wouldn't be able to do a lot of things, but get me on a racetrack, and my safe place is being in a broadcast box. In fact, Melbourne Cup Day, for instance, the build up to Melbourne Cup Day is pretty intense. There's a lot of interviews to do and a lot of preparation to do. The bit that I love the most about Melbourne Cup Day is rocking up and calling the first race, because I'm back where I feel more comfortable, believe it or not, standing at a pair of binoculars and calling horses down the straight. That's where I feel the most comfortable, that I'm in my zone. So, people close to me would probably be able to tell you I can't mow a lawn, I can't cook, can barely tie my shoelaces up, but I can call 24 horses up the straight. So you've got to be good at something.
You've been to a lot of, obviously, probably more than anybody. You've been to the races, just physically there, and you've probably seen between the 90s to now the evolution of media and the different dynamic at a race course. Can you give us some insight as to what you've seen the trend being from being on course at Flemington or one of the major Melbourne meets, and just tell us what the feel is like comparatively over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know racing people talk about this a lot. I remember going to the races in the 90s on a Wednesday at Flemington, or a Tuesday night twilight meeting at Moonee Valley, and you'd get 4,000 or 5,000, maybe even more there. You'd be wrestling for a seat. And now, the hill stand at Flemington, for instance, isn't open until Cup Week comes around. So it's interesting that the crowds are decreasing, but you still get good horses and nice weather, and you'll get decent crowds. And we've seen that recently at Caulfield at the Underwood Stakes, and also the Moonee Valley Friday night meeting. We had decent crowds, upwards of 10,000, to see horses like Imperatrice and Amelia's Jewel. But it has become a television sport. There is an element of churn to it, mainly because of the way we're funded here, and we're the envy of the world, the way our sport is funded with our prize money. But that Monday to Friday type of racing is very much for TV and a little part radio. Obviously, not a lot of your age group will really listen to radio anymore. It's
I don't reckon many of my age.
And everything.
I don't reckon many people my age actually own a radio. You'd say try and
little transistor
only in their cars now. It's amazing.
I know. Yeah. Well, it's an issue.
But I would even argue that people under 25 don't watch television. So that's changed. People are watching racing on mobile phones more than anything else. So that's definitely different. So as a result, and this is not sounding disrespectful, it's just a fact that you go to the races Monday to Friday, and it's like being at the barrier trials. There's pretty much no one there. So that, as a race caller, that makes it a little bit harder because you've got to get yourself up. It's very easy to get yourself up when there's atmosphere and there's a roar of the crowd, but when there isn't, that's a little bit different. So that's probably the major change, and I guess it's up to the powers that be to decide if, how we measure the success of racing. I'd still argue that people are consuming racing and it's as popular as it ever has been. It's just the way they consume it is completely different, and they don't have to go to the races to watch the races. So that's the real difference. And maybe you were talking about the pressure of race calling, Neil. Maybe that's why, because it's all about television now. And the other difference I find is if I make a mistake Turnbull Day on Saturday, they'll watch that race 30 years down the track because they're replaying race meetings from 30 years ago now.
Exactly.
On racing.com and the like. So they never disappear. This is the problem with the internet and these TV networks nowadays. These races just never disappear.
Yeah, well, Kingston Town couldn't win for 40 years now. So you know what I mean? Those calls go down in history. Matt, I saw that you broadcast the AFL Grand Final for SEN. You did the Friday night meeting at Moonee Valley, the Grand Final on Saturday. You do the Flemington meeting, I think it was on the Sunday. So it was a busy weekend. And from an early time in your broadcast career, you did broaden out into other sports, and even more so now. You're becoming in demand. But I suppose the temptation to do too much would be there because you call things race calling. How much of a burning desire do you have to do other sport?
Well, it's interesting because I'm sort of tarred with the same brush as the Ray Warrens and the Peter Donegans and Bruce McAvaney's and Ray Hadleys and those guys that were race callers that have gone on to do other things. Other sport, yeah. And I'm a curious soul. I love sport, absolutely love it. And I'm a believer if you can call a horse race, you can call anything. And so for me, that was sort of the burning desire. And as you say, I've been lucky enough to do things like Olympic Games and AFL and the tennis. So you're right, it's a balance. It is a balance because my sole role in racing is to be a race caller, and you want to be as accurate and as fresh as you possibly can be. So that's been the balance, particularly with the football this year. I think I called about 35 games of footy this year. So
that's a lot.
You have to, it is a lot considering that, it takes up your Thursday nights, takes up your Sundays. But it makes it easier when you absolutely love it. And the day that I get up out of bed and don't want to go is the day that you give it away. But at the moment, to go to Flemington on a Saturday and then go to the MCG on a Sunday, I've got to be the luckiest person and get paid for it. I mean, it's a rort, isn't it, really, when you think about it?
It's only a rort if you're not in on it, and you're in on it. Hey, Matt, I want to take you back. A famous part of your story was your near-death experience in Beijing in 2008. You probably get sick of talking about it, but personally, for myself, I was in Beijing working for News Corporation, running News Corp's coverage of the Olympic Games, and of course, I knew Ray Hadley well. And just so from my side of the fence, I remember sitting there, and Ray came over from the International Broadcast Centre and came and said, "Can I talk to you?" And it's a really sensitive matter. And he told me that you'd taken ill, and his body language, I just went, "How bad?" And he said, "I think it's real bad." Then he came and saw me again a few hours later and said that you were in a coma and being airlifted to Hong Kong, and people thought you weren't going to survive. So that was an incredible story that you went through, and of course you did survive. So can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so that was Beijing 2008, and of course
you were calling the rowing. The rowing.
Yeah,
at that
so
point?
I was alongside Ray Hadley calling the rowing, and we'd been there for probably 8 days, I think. We'd been through the opening ceremony, and Ray had called. We'd all taken part in the broadcast of the Socceroos' first soccer match, and then I was calling the rowing, and then early on, I just felt horrible, and it just got progressively worse. Like it's one of those things. If you feel a bit crooked at Olympic Games, you just keep ploughing on because it's what's the Olympics? I'll worry about it later. But it just got progressively worse to the extent where they literally had to carry me out of the studio, and I found myself in a Beijing hospital and ended up in an induced coma, things were just going downhill. And of course, it was the holy grail for the journalists, you remember, Neil, because there's always a build up to an Olympics. There's always something that's going to destroy an Olympics.
Yeah.
You know, I think it was Zika before Rio, wasn't it? And
that
and of course it was obviously, you know, terrorism before, I think London was the issue there. But before Beijing, it was air quality. It was the air.
Yeah.
And it seemed like it got me. And in the end, I was diagnosed. I came out of the coma. I had to be intubated, tube in the mouth, all that sort of stuff. I was diagnosed with a thing called melioidosis, which has got an acute death rate of 90%.
Wow.
And it was through air or dust. I breathed something in whilst I was there, and it nearly got me.
Like an airborne disease or something, was it?
Yeah, just a bug. Yeah. And I got that, if you could put it into racing parlance, I got that odds-on favourite beaten, because I think if I was a smoker, I was relatively fit, 27. If I was a smoker, I would have not been here. So it puts the Olympics into perspective. That was my first one, and I want to do about 20 more now. It made me, really, really fascinated more to do more Olympic Games. But it does put things into perspective, doesn't it? You haven't put your bins out on a Thursday night. It's not a major issue when you go through something like that. But yeah, and God bless Ray Hadley. He was worried sick like everybody else. The part of the story that is a little bit more dramatic was, as I was sitting in the Beijing hospital with double pneumonia and things were falling apart, and I had nurses looking over the top of me, not knowing what to do. The Australian team doctors, thanks to Ray, called in and had a look, and they said, we better place you in a coma. And before we do, we want to tell you that your mum loves you. Little did I know, at the other end, Mum was in Melbourne. Mum was told if Matt makes the flight from Beijing to Hong Kong, I was air-vac'd out of Beijing, if Matt makes the flight, he'll live. So it was pretty close.
Yeah. That was as Ray told us, because he was looking for News Corp to help with the sensitivities involved. Sure. You know what I mean? He was trying to manage all that stuff. Incredible stuff. And
the good thing is we've got a reunion coming up soon. I'll be with Ray in Paris next year. So all's well that ends well, as they say.
Well, mate, from an inauspicious start, you've now been to more Olympic Games than Michael Phelps, so you're doing well, Matt. hey, Matt. I know Will loves this. He loves to ask people like yourself, your favourite horses, your favourite calls. Do you have a favourite horse from the last several years that you've called in Melbourne?
Well, for mine, there was a few that I've loved. I mean, I loved Merchant Navy early on in my tenure, and obviously
won a Coolmore.
It's sort of
20-1 or something.
Yeah, got right up on the fence in spectacular style. For me, my favourite race was Vow and Declare, winning the Melbourne Cup, because it was, I don't think we'll ever see a finish like that again in a Melbourne Cup. It was absolutely crazy. Back when I was getting into racing, I loved horses like Superimpose and Better Loosen Up, that era with Let's Elope, that famous Cox Plate early in the 90s. And probably my favourite call, I loved the Caulfield Guineas of Redute's Choice beating Testarossa, Greg Miles's call of that. I think that is probably the best race call I've ever heard.
And then pins, it's Testarossa clear though. Redute's Choice is coming again. Testarossa has to find. Redute's digs, he lunges and wins. Redute's Choice beat Testarossa, a magnificent Guineas.
They're all inspiring, aren't they? They're all moments that you never forget, and they just keep you wanting to go to the races, because the great thing about racing is you just never know what you're about to see.
I know, and you talk about those great horses, and Will and I have spoken about it. Mackay Diva comes along, and you go, well, we'll never see that again. And then, different horse, Black Caviar turned up. Oh, we'll never see that again. Winks turned up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's always one coming. There's always a champion, always.
And the thing is, and I talked about, watching the races day in, day out, there could be a maidener out there somewhere, or a horse in a paddock that hasn't had a start yet as a 4-year-old that could be the next Winks or Black Caviar. They might be there somewhere.
That is literally what I rest my life on, that there's one out there coming through.
There's one in the Freedman stable.
If that dream
at Rose Hill.
goes, if that dream goes, I'm going back down the line.
Do you dabble in owning any little shares, Matt?
I do. I tinker around with 3 or 4. We've recently had a horse called Hello Broadcast race down here. You mentioned the Sydney job. Darren Flindell's in Hello Broadcast as well.
Yeah.
Along with Dan Malecki, the race callers. So you can probably work out how we got to that name. So Hello Broadcast has become a bit of an enigma. He's won a couple of races at Sandown on a Wednesday. But a couple of other country horses. I just like tinkering around with them. And like getting the photos on the wall, to be honest, to fill up the study. But as Will could testify, what do they say? Give a depressed man a racehorse and it gives him hope.
Yeah, or you can insult a man's wife, but not his horse.
Oh, yes. We've been there before.
Yeah, well, I ran 4th in an Ipswich maiden with a tiny share yesterday, so don't insult that
You're
horse.
going huge then.
It's not too bad. You're going all right.
It's better than last, I suppose. Well, good on you, Matt Hill. It's been absolutely a pleasure to spend some time with you, and we wish you all the best for the remainder of the Spring Carnival. We're sure that you'll absolutely blitz the Cox Plate again this year and the Melbourne Cup, the 2 big ones. It's been wonderful to spend some time with you here on The Heart of Racing. Matt Hill, we're going to be hearing your voice for many, many years to come, and as I said earlier, the career at the end is going to be up there and possibly the top 5 of all time in Australia. It is Will, isn't it?
Yeah, no, he's truly the theatre of racing. Him and a couple of others, they really bring racing to the masses. Without them, we're nothing. So thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much for your kind words. And look, we're purely the narrator, but it is a lovely thing to do. And it's lovely to think that at the end of a race wedding, you put your bag in the back of the boot and you just had a little part to play in it.
What do you do on a Saturday night? Last question.
Not a lot. No, not
crash
a lot.
out crash out and watch the trots.
Pretty much. A couple of Scotch and Cokes, watch the trots, and if I'm in bed after 9 o'clock, that's usually very late for me on a Saturday night. Might go out for dinner, but I'm usually pretty tired by a Saturday night. Like everybody in racing, I don't think Saturday nights are the night to kick on because everyone's usually had enough.
Who do you support in the footy?
I'm a Western Bulldogs supporter,
Oh, no.
so. I don't have to worry too much about buying tickets in September.
Oh, well, they did, right?
You won it only.
They won it at 5 years.
He beat my mob in the grand final.
Oh, you're a Swanee.
No, I am, but I'm slowly moving to GWS because I'm a bit.
They're down the road from you at Rose Hill. You're kidding. Yeah. Well, my 2 teams got rolled, so the Lions and the Broncos leave me out of it. Hey, Matt Hill, have a great carnival.
Terrific, boys. Pleasure. Thank you very much.